All right, well, as you see, we've got a viewer's car that was just dropped off by tow truck. I actually had a viewer a few years ago mention they love the scene where the tow truck drops the car off and unloads it. Not sure why, but I don't think it was this viewer that mentioned it. If it was, I'll bet he doesn't feel that way right now. But what we've got here is a Mazda, I don't even know what it is. Looks like maybe a Mazda 3. I'm not sure what year, maybe around 2018 or so. And according to the owner, who again is a viewer of the channel, they were sitting, I believe, at a red light, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the engine just dies with a puff of black smoke coming out of the exhaust pipe. The car started back up, but the guy was totally freaked out, of course, by this and decided the safest thing to do is to immediately drive the car to the nearest parking lot and have it towed over to his house, which he did. The owner then, I believe, had like a mobile mechanic maybe come over. I'm not quite sure how somebody looked at it, but I believe a couple people looked at it and they immediately came to the conclusion that it was a blown head gasket. And when we look at the oil in just a second, it's definitely going to look that way. The owner then contacted me and asked if I might be interested in taking a look at the car. Obviously, after hearing this backstory, I thought it was going to be a no-brainer. Just go over, we'll do the compression test, we're going to find it's a blown head gasket, and we go from there. Well, I did go over there, did the compression test. The compression test showed normal, and of course, you guys who are regulars on the channel know that that means nothing. If you've got a negative on a compression test, it really honestly means nothing. We've seen so many false negatives now. If you have a positive on a compression test, yes, without question. But the compression test showed negative, and then also some other things that I did indicated to me that maybe this is not actually a blown head gasket after all. And I'm not quite sure why we've got the coolant mixed in the oil, but that's where we're at. We'll go ahead and we'll catch you up to where I am by repeating the tests that I did in the field when I looked at the guy's car in person. We decided to have it towed over. The guy only lives like 5 minutes away from me in the neighborhood, one over from me. But because when you see the condition of the oil, I decided it was really safest to just go ahead and tow the car over, because since I don't believe we have any major damage, we didn't want to take the chance of causing it by driving without any proper lubrication in the engine. I think the first thing we'll do is we'll give you a look at this oil, and yeah, any hack is going to immediately just look at it and go, oh, you got a blown head gasket. Well, I'm not so sure. We'll see what the evidence finds, but let's take a look at the dipstick real quick. All right, we'll give you a look at this. Oh man, yeah, that is really awesome. Let's get you a good look at this. All right, we can see the oil just oozing off of it like a melted milkshake. And that's exactly what it looks like, is a chocolate milkshake. I'm sure you guys have seen this before, many of you. And we also notice another thing too. Let me wipe this down. If we notice, this car has been sitting a really long time, so the oil's settled, and look at the level of the oil there. Take one more look at that there just to be sure. Yep, look at that. The oil level just about halfway up the dipstick there. And that, of course, is going to indicate that we have a massive amount of coolant in the oil pan. The oil, of course, floats on the coolant, and it raises the level because you've got we've got probably quarts of coolant in there, I'm guessing. So once again, just from that, of course, most anybody, even with some experience, is going to just immediately conclude a blown head gasket. Well, if we got a blown head gasket, we will have evidence of that, either through a loss of compression to the cooling system or to pressure in the cooling system from a compression chamber that is compromised, which is my favorite way of doing it because, as we know on this channel, compression tests are stupid, especially when they show negative, which this one will. So let's start off with the basics. Let's get a compression test, and I'll show you what I found the first time I did this. All right, well, as you can clearly see, we do not have a loss of compression in any cylinders. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there isn't a compromise in any of the cylinders. We may just not be able to detect it through the compression test. We have shown conclusively that you can get false negatives on the compression test. We've even shown why that can happen and experimentally designed some explanations to prove that as much. So the fact that the compression test is negative is, of course, meaningless because compression tests are stupid. Obviously, we know the second thing we want to do is something a lot more sensitive and definitive, and we want to look for any trace of compression in the cooling system. So that was the next thing I did. Let's go ahead and do that. If we have to run this engine any length of time in order to do this diagnosis, one of the first things I want to do is probably change the oil and filter to get rid of the contaminated oil, which is not going to be lubricating the engine very well. If we do not have a serious engine fault, we don't want to be running the engine with this oil and then introduce one when the lack of lubrication causes a massive failure. So that is actually going to be a priority if we have to end up running this engine. All right, what we're going to do now is I'm going to put a pressure sensor onto the radiator, and we are going to look and see, do we have any evidence of combustion entering the cooling system at all? All right, well, in doing this test, I topped off the coolant a little bit to try to maximize the ability to detect pressure in the system. And if we look real close here, we can see there is actually some brownish tint to the coolant. That appears to indicate that there is also oil in the coolant as well as coolant in the oil. One of the things that obviously I'm thinking, if all of our engine tests show negative, could be a faulty engine oil cooler. That would be a location where you would have coolant and oil together, and possibly a compromise there could cause them to mix. But hopefully that'll be the case, because that would actually be very minor compared to, say, a blown head gasket. All right, let's get our pressure transducer set up. All right, and I, of course, have videos ad nauseum now on these techniques. You can look back and see them if you're new and not familiar with this basic stuff here. But all we're going to do is I've just got a pressure transducer connected up to the radiator neck. And of course, if we have compression entering the cooling system, we are going to be able to detect those pulses of compression with a pressure transducer. So not rocket science here by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not really interested in how much pressure there is, just interested in if we have it. All right, I want to maximize my sensitivity. That should be pretty good. So just barely even touching the radiator hose, we can see I get a waveform. Give you a little better view of that. So just any slight amount of pressure in that radiator, I'm able to detect on my scope here. And what we're going to do is just crank this engine over and see if we build up any pressure in a stepwise fashion, indicating a contribution from one of the cylinders to entering combustion into the cooling system. All right, even just the movement of the engine while cranking is going to probably cause some change. See, just my getting in the car is able to be detected just right there. So we should easily see if we've got combustion entering the coolant. Let's wait for a fresh screen. And again, we're just going to do a clear flood mode crank. You can hear the cadence of the compression is perfectly normal. And that's plenty for me. There is no combustion entering this cooling system. Just closing the door, you can even sense it. But we didn't sense it from any combustion pressure entering the cooling system. Let's take another look back at that to be sure. All right, we can see no evidence whatsoever. I realize I did make one little mistake here, though. Let me just take a look back here. And that is, we may not be covering up the overflow tube. It looks like we are, I'm not totally sure. So We're going to go ahead and clamp that off to completely seal the system. Redo this one more time just to be 100%, but honestly, even with that tube open, we would have detected it. Let's go ahead and run again. Get you back on the scope. And honestly, this test I always do anytime I'm suspecting some type of a compromise in a combustion chamber to the cooling system. This is so much more reliable than a compression test. We've proven that. Let's verify we've got sensitivity. We do. Let's try this one more time. All right, again, just closing the door, we're able to sense a change in the cooling system pressure. This is a very, very sensitive test. Yeah, there is no compression in this cooling system. Go back and verify that. So that's like 4 times now that I've done this test, because I also did this test in the field in front of the customer. We can clearly see we're not building any evidence of compression in this cooling system at all. So that means we've got one final test that I also did in the field that I will replicate for you, and then we will be all caught up to where I am now, because I do not know what is wrong with this car. Just want to walk through the steps that I already did to catch you guys up with me. All right, well, this guy was told by several people to prepare for a $4,500 bill for replacing a cylinder head gasket. As you can see, there is no evidence whatsoever of a cylinder head gasket compromise. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. We've got very strong evidence this is not a head gasket, as a matter of fact. So what I did is the final thing before I told him, yeah, you're going to need to tow this over. And what I did was I got a cooling system pressure pump. Let me go grab it. All right, what I did is I pumped up the system here, look at the decay, and then I checked inside the cylinders by removing the spark plugs to look for any coolant escaping. If we look, though, on my gauge, we can see we've got a pretty rapid decay rate. We are definitely losing coolant somewhere, and that coolant is going into the engine. Look how rapid that decay is. And just to make sure, yeah, I'm not, this should seal my overflow. Let me just check that. Yeah, this definitely seals the overflow. Just in case it's not. It's definitely sealing, but I'm just going to go ahead and clamp that overflow just in case. This is a significant leak somewhere. One of the things is that I can't hear the leak. Usually you hear it gurgle or something. All right, we see we build up our pressure. Rapid decay. Let me take another listen. Yeah, I don't hear anything. Yeah, I hear absolutely nothing while this pressure is just decaying almost as fast as I can pump it up. All right, and just that quick, we already lose all of our pressure. In the field, I did remove the spark plugs to take a look in there, see if we would see coolant leaking into the cylinders. Most definitely didn't see anything at all. One of the things I may try, let me remove this dipstick here. I want to try one of a couple things. All right, one of them, I'm going to pump this up again, and I'm going to listen and hear if I can detect any noise through the oil dipstick tube. Yep, I definitely can. Maybe you guys can too. Let me see if we can give you a listen to this. All right, I will try to enhance that audio for you, but it kind of sounds almost like a frying egg a little bit with some cavitation or bubbling, a fancy word there. And you can kind of hear sort of a sizzling sound almost coming from that oil dipstick. Just as a control. It's not there now as my pressure has completely subsided. So definitely we've got some connection with the cooling system and the oil for sure. We have definitely confirmed that through sound. One of the things I'm wondering now, oh, by the way, we are caught up. We are completely caught up now. This is now where I am at with you guys, because in the field when I tried to do that, it was just too noisy outdoors and you couldn't hear anything. In my nice quiet garage, definitely I can hear something. So we are definitely caught up here. One of the things I'm kind of thinking, I wonder if I can reverse this. In other words, can I put pressure in the oil system and see that reflected from the coolant? I think I may go ahead and try that. All right, I'm just going to top this off with just water like that. See some oil floating in there, by the way. And what I'm going to do is add a little pressure into the oil system. And if there is connection between the oil and cooling system, I'm hoping we'll see some bubbles come out of there. And actually, one of the things I just realized, there's PCV hose up here. I need to clamp that so that everything doesn't escape through the PCV. Okay, now we got PCV clamped off. Let's see what happens. Oh, look at that. Well, that worked pretty well. Okay, so we definitely have a connection between the oiling system and the cooling system, and it is not through a combustion chamber there. So we now have a much better direction to go. We want to consider any locations on the vehicle where the oil and the coolant come in contact with each other, not physically, but in proximity. And my first thought would be a oil cooler, because the oil cooler is going to have some lines for the oil, some lines for the coolant, and if there is a failure on that unit, that would allow oil to mix with coolant and vice versa. Hey, that was pretty cool. I've actually never done this before, but that worked amazing. Look at that. Almost looks like a blown head gasket there, but we're not going through a combustion chamber. We're just simply going through the oil dipstick tube. All right, of course, I'm going to bring you guys along for this. This should be pretty dramatic. We're going to go ahead and drain this oil real quick here and just see. Let me see if we can catch this on camera, but I'm anticipating this to be pretty freaking cool. Oh, how about that? All coolant all over my camera too. And now comes the oil, which just looks like chocolate milk. All right, that was pretty cool. Let me go clean up my camera a little bit, and then we're gonna try to find where our issue is here. Now there's a good look at the milkshake we've got going on here. What a mess. We still haven't totally found for sure where the issue is, and we also may not be out of the woods yet. We want to keep in mind all the possible variables here. One possibility could be a crack in the engine block. Therefore, we would never see compression loss in the cylinder or combustion entering the cooling system. We do need to consider that as a possibility, particularly if we find maybe this car doesn't actually have an oil cooler or something that would explain this. So we just want to hold off all bets right now. So right now, I think my strategy is I'm going to go ahead and chase down some type of a oil cooler or something where the oil and coolant would be in proximity with each other like that. All right, well, this is a massive, massive problem because there is no oil cooler on this. I have checked thoroughly. I swear I thought these Mazdas had oil coolers, and most definitely it does not. So that is actually a massive change in direction now, because I was really banking that that would be our issue, that a oil cooler issue would be our best explanation. That is obviously now eliminated. Yeah, there is no oil cooler on here. So this is going to be, at the very minimum, something much more problematic. And at worst, this actually is more likely now to be a cracked block, like I mentioned earlier, but in a location that has nothing to do with the combustion chamber at all. So we're never going to see this on a leak down or a compression or a coolant pressure or anything like that in a combustion chamber. I believe this is going to most likely be a crack in the block between an oil galley and a coolant passage. For those of you guys not familiar, let's just review that real quick because I actually have a pretty good example on the car next to me. And then we'll come up with a strategy on how we're going to deal with this, because typically you would have to remove a cylinder head in order to find such a crack. And there is no way I'm removing the cylinder head from this vehicle and have two non-running cars in my garage right now. So let's take a look at this. All right, well, this is what we're trying not to progress towards on this other guy's car. But basically, with the cylinder head removed here, you can see we've got coolant jackets around our cylinders. We've got a coolant passage right here. You can probably see coolant in there maybe. All right, probably more from this angle. I can see coolant in there. And typically, this is a bad example because this is a pushrod engine. But typically on the overhead cam engines, you can also have holes. This is just a bolt hole right here for the cylinder head. But you can also have oil passage holes here, that are adjacent to these coolant passages or coolant jackets. And of course, a crack between an oil passage and the coolant passage would absolutely explain our symptoms. We can see if we had like a oil passage here and there was a crack between the coolant passage and oil passage, it would have nothing to do with our compression in any way whatsoever. So in that case, the negative compression test is absolved because it is truly negative. Now, if we look here in this valley where the lifters would be, which I've removed here, in here, you won't be able to see it, but in here, there is a oil passage that feeds that lifter right there. And that oil passage, you can see, would be adjacent with this coolant passage. So a crack in there, for example, on this particular engine would cause that same phenomenon, and you would have no impact at all whatsoever with the compression. And also typically what would happen, you've got, on this car, maybe between 40 and 60 PSI on the oil pressure with the engine running. So you would drive oil into that coolant jacket with the engine running. But then when you shut the engine off, well, now your oil pressure is 0. However, your cooling system is still at maybe 12 PSI, and that's going to push coolant into the oil while the vehicle is at rest, and that's the way that would work. Now, the problem is, how would we find such a thing without removing the cylinder head? And the answer to that is you really can't. The only other alternative would be that we maybe have the crack in a location where we could discover it otherwise. We need to exhaust all those possibilities, but I think that they're pretty low percentage chances. One possibility could be, if we look at this cylinder here, it's nearly at bottom dead center. And what we may possibly have is a crack in the compression chamber, but at the very, very, very bottom of the piston stroke that we would be able to find with a leak down test. And it may be at the very, very bottom of the stroke while we still have overlap between the intake and exhaust valves, but then the leak down wouldn't work until the exhaust valve is closed as we come up the compression stroke. But if we could catch with a leak down tester at bottom dead center at the start of the compression stroke, we may be able to find some evidence that way. And while I think there's 0% chance we're going to find it like that, but I do think we're going to go ahead and try to do that anyway, because it's worth that minuscule chance if we can get conclusive proof of a catastrophic failure. Also, if we succeeded in getting a positive on that, it would definitely confirm that a cylinder head gasket is not going to fix the issue, which I really don't think it will, so there's still some value in this. Because obviously the last thing is we want this guy to get a cylinder head gasket as recommended and then find you still have the problem because it's not associated with the cylinder head. So I think we're going to go ahead and try that bottom dead center leak down just in case we get lucky. We need to be smart about this too so we don't get a false positive. Any leakage past the rings, of course, would then pressurize the oil system, and we just saw that pressurizing the oil system will reflect in the coolant, right? So we'll need to make sure that we've got the oil drain plug out and the PCV open atmosphere and everything when we do that, so we don't pressurize the oil system if there's any leakage at all past the rings. All right, there are some other variables to this to consider, but again, proving them can be really problematic. The very best case, absolute best case scenario that we could have at this point would be a lower intake manifold gasket leak. On a lot of cars, lower intake manifolds will have passages for coolant and oil in proximity together. This is something I'm not sure if this car has, and I don't know how much exploratory surgery I want to go into. A known example of this would be on a lot of the kind of older GM, was it the 3100 or maybe the 3400 V6 engines, where they would have a intake manifold leak that the gasket on the intake manifold would fail and the coolant would then leak and get into the oil system, which was a known issue. There was a technical service bulletin on those. I know I've replaced a number of those gaskets. This could still need a head gasket in that there could be a head gasket failure between a coolant passage and the oil galley. Man, that just seems really, really unlikely, because I think if you're going to get that kind of a warp, the idea that you wouldn't have something also external to the engine or to the combustion chamber, that would be really, really unlikely, I think. But it is technically possible. Again, the only way you would be able to confirm that would be removing the cylinder head. And of course, another variable would be, instead of the crack being on the block, like I kind of showed earlier where that would be, the crack would be on the cylinder head, but the same concept, a crack between the oil passage and a coolant passage with the cylinder head itself. Again, you're not going to find that unless you remove a cylinder head. This gets to be a real problem because you also wonder, well, how do we go about charging a customer for this? Because I don't intend on charging the customer if I find that there is a catastrophic failure. But if you're running a professional shop, I'm do-it-yourselfer, if you run a professional shop, you have to charge for this. And that gets a little sticky. I mean, how does that conversation go? Yeah, we think that your engine is completely toasted, but we need to charge you $500 in labor to really prove it. And then when we find that it is totally toasted and you need a $6,000 engine replacement, we'll credit you 2 hours of labor. Like, I don't even know how that conversation would go. I have no idea. And to be honest, I don't care because I'm not a professional mechanic, so I'm not even going to deal with that. My job is I need to be 100% certain that even if I can't show a compromise with this engine in its integrity, that I have 100% certainty that that is the case. And the problem is I'm not positive that I have a way that I'm going to be able to do that. So I want to exhaust every possibility to find any conclusive evidence that I can say, I don't know exactly where this compromise is between the oil and cooling system, but it is something that is going to cost you thousands of dollars to repair. That is where I need to be before I return this car. So really, I think our only chance of doing that is with the leak down test, even though I think it's not going to show anything. Let's go ahead and give it a try. Okay, we're just firing through these. I don't even know if I caught the previous cylinder on film. This is the third cylinder, and you see this one's good too. We got one more to do. And while I set this one up, one of the things some of you guys with a little more technical knowledge are wondering is, why am I even bothering with this? Because there is just 0% chance. Because, yeah, this would be great because of the coolant in the oil, but how do you explain the oil in the coolant on something that we are going to detect through a leak down test? And I couldn't agree more. The only thing that I'm banking on, and I am not banking very much on it, is because of that extremely high oil level, that maybe the oil level is reaching above the crankcase, possibly when the engine's running, and thrashing oil to a point where it could be entering the cooling system. I know that's a stretch, I agree. But the thing is, I have to try to find some kind of evidence to tell this guy his engine is blown. All right, this is the final cylinder. This one doesn't have quite as good of leak down, which is the reason why I've opened up the oil system. If that leak down was past the rings, we would see the coolant bubbling if the oil system was sealed, and that would give us a false positive on this. We would falsely then claim that we've got an engine block compromise. So this did not help us find anything. One of the things that I think I will do is let's do a little research for the intake manifold, but I can look at this intake manifold and I can tell you there is no coolant through this intake manifold on this model. Well, this is getting more grim by the minute because I've got a diagram on the top end of the engine here with intake manifold and everything. There is no possibility of a coolant leak through that intake like there is on some other models. So that is eliminated. This is going to be at best, a cylinder head gasket because there is a compromise or a warp between an oil galley and a coolant passage. At worst, and my inclination would be to believe that there is going to be a crack somewhere. This is a really substantial leak too, so it's really a shame because we would visibly be able to see it for sure if it wasn't in a inaccessible area because of the rate of decay that we had on our coolant pressure test. So I'm not quite sure what more we can do here. All we know is that at the very least, this cylinder head needs to come off. We'll have to talk with our viewer about that. Some of the things that you guys may be thinking also is why not remove a valve cover, see if we can look for something there. There won't be anything there. This problem at best is going to be between the surface of the cylinder head and the block surface. At best, that is where the issue will be. You're not going to see that through the valve cover. When I was draining the oil, you might have noticed this oil pan is very easy to remove, and maybe that would be helpful. What we would see if we remove the oil pan, other than a whole bunch of milkshake sludge, is we would be looking up, of course, at the crankshaft. And if we pressurize the system from somewhere along there, we would see a stream of coolant that would come out as fast as I pump up the system. But we're never going to be able to see like a crack from where that coolant is coming from, not from through the bottom of the engine. We would see the coolant drip from somewhere, might even be cool. I'm not going to do it because it's not going to answer the question, is this as simple as a head gasket replacement to fix the seal between the oil and the coolant passage, or is this a crack in either the cylinder head or the block? If it's a crack in the block, this engine's pretty much done, right? We don't even know if there's a crack, much less a gasket failure, and if the crack would be in the cylinder head or the block. The final thing is, of course, how did this happen? You don't just sit at a red light and have a blown gasket or a cracked head or a cracked block, right? But what I believe happened is there was some issue going on where most likely the car overheated, didn't realize on the overheat, and it was then having this compromise, fills up the oil with coolant as a result of that compromise. The driver is unaware of this most likely. And then at some point, the coolant gets to such a high level, the crankshaft churn probably picked some of the oil up into the combustion chamber, and thus the failure of the engine at the time with the big black smoke. I've actually seen similar from a car that came in here where the Jiffy Lube failed to drain the old oil before adding the new oil, and the car was just puffing black smoke out of the exhaust, and it was because of exact that phenomenon. So, boy. I think what I'm going to do is go ahead and let the customer know where we're at, and We'll probably close out this video. I'll fill it with some fresh oil. He can drive it home because he just lives such a short distance, and we'll follow up and see what he decides to do. Hey, Bill, it's Matt. How you doing?
Good.
Good.
Yourself?
Well, doing all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to fill you in on what's going on with your car. By the way, as you know, I'm going to do the video on this, so I hope you don't mind if maybe we possibly include our conversation as part of the video.
No, it's fine. Go.
Okay, great, Bill. I appreciate that. Well, it's not looking very good at all. So much to my surprise, I have found that there is not an oil cooler on this vehicle. So it went downhill. As you remember, the reason it's here is because I was expecting that we're going to have a leak in the oil cooler, which explains the oil coolant mix. And also there's not only coolant in the oil, as you well know, but there is also as well oil in the coolant. So a oil cooler would make the most sense. This car does not have one. It also has what's called a dry intake manifold. So there is no possibility of a coolant leakage through the intake manifold, which would be your next best thing. The problem is that there is no way of knowing where this leak is, but I do know that there is some type of compromise in the engine between the oil system and the cooling. The video will show where I pressurize the oil system and the coolant bubbles right out of the radiator. The causes of this, the best possible cause for this would be somehow a compromise in the cylinder head gasket between an oil passage and a coolant passage. I think that's really unlikely. The most likely explanation for this is going to be a crack either in the block or in the cylinder head that is between the oil and coolant passages, but not anywhere near the combustion chamber, which is why the compression test showed good.
Right.
No matter how you look at it, at best, the cylinder head would have to come off. And I think the biggest mistake would be to just replace the head gasket, because if you don't find where this crack is, and it's not a failure with the head gasket, you put that new head gasket in and the same problem is going to still be there, right?
Correct. Okay. Well, that's not what I wanted to hear. Okay, I suppose you're just going to put the car back together again and I'll come pick it up. We'll start working on the white car,
yeah.
And then you and I can talk more about, what makes sense to do with this blue car. And then you and I will just continually talk about putting the blue car into your schedule, because I'm inclined to just fix it.
Okay.
Because
okay.
I think once it gets fixed, it's going to still be a decently reliable car.
Except for, of course, if the block is cracked, you're going to have to replace the engine, obviously. If the cylinder head is cracked, then yeah, I would say that's a good thing. If the block is cracked, well, then we got to talk.
All right, perfect.
All right,
Thank
buddy.
you very much, sir. Bye.
Yeah, welcome. Sorry. Bye. All right, well, the short of it is he does want to fix the car. Obviously, right now, for those of you guys that are aware, I've got my Trans Am that is waiting on cylinder heads. That is going to be a couple months before those even come in. I can't take a major project right now, but he does want to pursue this further. So once I get my Trans Am running and out of the way, that'll free up one of my extra bays here for a big project. And we'll go ahead and remove the cylinder head on this, and we will pursue what the issue is with this. So it'll be months from now, but we'll follow up at some point. All right, I know this is a little bit disappointing. I know it's really disappointing for Bill, but thanks for watching. Hope you learned something new out of this at least, and we will follow up when we get a chance.